week 13 of the fantasy football season, and his running back start sits. So this week, the first start, Bijan Robinson of the Atlanta Falcons. So Bijan Robinson finally had that monster game and his best game of the season coming off a bye. And usually rookies that get going and really get more playing time after the bye week, where he had the best game of his career versus the Saints. Week 13, a good matchup at the New York Jets. They give up the ninth most fantasy points to running backs on the season. So right now, Bijan, he's going to be more involved in the offense. He came off of 19 total touches and had the game with a rush, 2 touchdowns, a rushing and a receiving touchdown. And we know he's one of the better receiving backs out of the backfield. So this week here, I know it's a bit tougher matchup than versus the Saints. But like I said, Bijan does a lot out of the backfield, catching the football. That run defense really isn't all that great. And this week, once again, he's a start. Next start, Kyren Williams of the Los Angeles Rams. So Kyren Williams, after missing 4 games with his ankle injury, came back with a vengeance and had a monster performance in that one with 38 fantasy points in that game, 143 rush yards, rushing touchdown, and he did a lot in the passing game as well. So this week, I know it's a tough matchup versus the Cleveland Browns here for Kyren Williams and this Los Angeles Rams team, and the Browns better defenses versus the run this season. But Kyren Williams, he could do it all. We saw it in last week's ball game. We saw it before he got injured. And even missing those 4 weeks, he's still in the top 10 in fantasy points at the position. The next start, Javonte Williams of the Denver Broncos. Javonte Williams had a middle-of-the-pack game, 12 victory versus the Cleveland Browns. So this week here, a good matchup at the Houston Texans, a team you can run the football on. And Javonte Williams, he's looked pretty healthy over the last few weeks, coming off that off-season ACL injury. So this week here with a decent matchup at Houston, and he's getting a good workload, except passing downs, going to McLaughlin and Samaje Perine. I think Williams could carve out solid number 2 running back numbers for your team. Next start, Derrick Henry, the Tennessee Titans. Derrick Henry, he had a nice game in last week's game, finding the end zone twice. And this week here, it's a matchup versus the Indianapolis Colts. The team, obviously, he's on throughout his career, playing them twice a season in the division. So Derrick Henry, I know the best years are behind him, but he still has that capability of having some monster fantasy games like we saw him have in the Week 12 game. So Derrick Henry, track record versus Indianapolis. And once again this week, I think he goes out there and puts in a good performance. Next start, Najee Harris to the Pittsburgh Steelers. Najee Harris, the last 4 out of 5 weeks, he's actually had double-digit fantasy points. And for the most part, the workload's 50-50 between him and Jaylen Warren. So this week here, a great matchup versus the Cardinals. They give up the second most fantasy points to running backs on the season. We just saw Kyren Williams come off injury and have a monster game versus Arizona defense. First time this season, pretty much, Najee Harris is a running back I'm recommending to start with a good matchup and then still getting the short yardage and goal line work and a 50-50 split. I like him this week. The next start, David Montgomery of the Detroit Lions. So David Montgomery was more involved in that game in the loss versus the Green Bay Packers in Week 12. So this week here, tougher matchup in New Orleans. But the Saints gave up a lot of points and running yards to Bijan Robinson. So this week, David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs, 50-50 split once again. Well, Montgomery, he's been given a majority of the goal line touches, and we know he's a decent receiver out of the backfield as well. So right now, I like the backfield over there, both running backs for Detroit. And Montgomery, each and every week when he's healthy, he's been putting up number 2 running back numbers. And the final start, Devin Singletary of the Houston Texans. Devin Singletary, he got a decent workload, but Dameon Pierce returned in that loss versus the Jacksonville Jaguars in Week 12. But this week, a great matchup for Singletary and this Texan team versus the Denver Broncos that give up the most fantasy points to running backs on the season. So Singletary, we know, better catch passer out of the backfield than of Dameon Pierce, better pass protection as well. But with Pierce back in the mix, he's definitely going to get some work once again. But Singletary receiving ability is a star once again. Now to the sits, A.J. Dillon of the Green Bay Packers. So A.J. Dillon, he really hasn't done much this season when he's been the man, but very tough matchup versus the Kansas City Chiefs, one of the best run defenses in the league. I know Josh Jacobs last week, he broke a big one, but if he didn't, he really didn't have that much of a fantasy day than was Jacobs. A.J. Dillon, we know he could catch the football out of the backfield a little bit. Big physical back in between the tackles. But this week versus Kansas City, a game where they're most likely trailing early and often, and possibly Aaron Jones could return as well. He's not a running back I could trust. Next sit, Chuba Hubbard of the Carolina Panthers. So Hubbard, he definitely came off a nice game, 20 fantasy points in last week's game versus the Tennessee Titans, but obviously it wasn't enough for this Panther team to get the win, and they fired head coach Frank Reich. So we'll see if it's going to be Sanders or Hubbard now getting the touches over there. But either way, I don't like any running back. I know Tampa Bay's defense this season really hasn't been good, and Jonathan Taylor just found the end zone twice in last week's game versus Tampa Bay Buck defense. But this week with a bad offensive line, new head coach, and we'll see Sanders or Hubbard. But this week, I would shy away from him. Next to Kareem Hunt of the Cleveland Browns. So to me, Kareem Hunt's best days are behind him. And obviously, he's a running back getting up there in that 28, 29-year-old range where we know usually running backs fall apart and their better seasons are behind them and past their prime. So Kareem Hunt last week was a non-factor in that one in the loss at the Denver Broncos. And this week hit the Rams. I don't see him doing much. Jerome Ford, he's been the way better back this season in terms of yard per carry and catching the football out of the backfield. So Kareem Hunt pretty much, he's been a change of pace back and a guy just getting carries to keep this offense on the field and try to keep things going. Next sits Kenneth Walker of the Seattle Seahawks. So Kenneth Walker hasn't been that great of a year. I know got off to a hot start early in the season, but then he had a couple games here and there where he did well, and last week he missed that game versus San Francisco 49ers in Week 12. And right here, Week 13, Thursday night game at the Cowboys, one of the better defenses in the league. I know if there's any weakness with this Cowboy team, though, you can run the football on them, but Kenneth Walker has competition back there with Zach Charbonnet over the last month of the season where he's getting a lot of his touches, even though Charbonnet, he didn't do much in last week's game versus the Niners. I still think he's going to be a factor in this one. And if the Seattle team's trailing early and often at this high-powered Cowboy offense right now over the last month of the season where they're blowing teams out left and right, then I don't think Walker is going to do much because, believe it or not, in the passing game, his numbers haven't been all that great this season. So with him coming off injury and Charbonnet back there in a tough matchup, he's a running back I would sit next to Antonio Gibson of the Washington Commanders. So this Commander team, we know Brian Robinson, the number one back over there. Gibson, more the third down and the receiving back. But last week we didn't see Gibson do much in that game versus the Dallas Cowboys. And this Miami defense, for the most part, they've been pretty solid versus running backs on the season. So Brian Robinson, he's going to get his work, and he's been a better receiver out of the backfield as well as Robinson over the last few weeks. So with Gibson being up and down this season and a tough running back to trust weekly, I would just sit him next to Devon Kane of the Miami Dolphins. So Kane, we know he's a great talent. We know he's got breakaway speed, runs over 20 miles per hour. Kane, one of the fastest running backs in the league, but the knee injury's definitely been a concern. He was on IR for 4 weeks with the injury. Then he came back in that Week 10 game. He got hurt once again, and last week he didn't suit up at the New York Jets. So this week I think he's going to suit up at Washington, but Jeff Wilson had a decent workload and look good. So right now, Kane, he could be back to that number 3 running back position. But even if he plays in this game and he's the backup running back, he's still not really a running back I could trust this week. You got to wait and see if he's healthy and could get things going. And the final running back I look to sit is DeAndre Swift, Philadelphia Eagles. So this week, a tough matchup versus San Francisco 49ers, where they don't really give running backs a lot of running room, and they get to that backfield and get to the running back. To beat San Francisco is spreading them out and throw the football over them, where I think this obviously is going to be a shootout between the San Francisco 49ers and this Philadelphia Eagle team. So DeAndre Swift, it's been a solid season for him, no doubt about it. But some games he really didn't have some great games. Like last week, only 9.40 fantasy points in PPR league. So right now, Swift for the most part has been great, but with a tough matchup coming up, game is with San Francisco is great against the run. He's a sit for me. So that start sits Week 13 of the fantasy football season.